Good morning, Hope Lutheran Church. This is Pastor Dan Severson coming to you actually from my wife's office manager's office, which used to be first the bedroom for my son Eric, then the bedroom for my son Carl, both of whom have moved away, as you know, and now it is the office for Kirsten's office manager. But this is Saturday morning. The days are running together. It's hard to keep track of which day is which. It's Saturday morning, and I thought I would begin sharing with you some of the material that hopefully you received by email. If you haven't and would like to receive a written form of the lectures that I'm going to be working on, I would be happy to send you those. All you have to do is let me know. As you know, the title of the class was something to the effect of the unforgettable characters and history of Israel. And so we will be focusing mostly on the biblical text itself, not on outside sources. But I do want to mention some ways in which we do Bible study, because I'm going to be utilizing some of those approaches as we go through the story of the Bible as we have it in the canonical books of the Old and New Testament. So, first of all, a question some of you may have, maybe you do, maybe you don't, is how did the Bible as we have it now come into being? Why were these particular books chosen as opposed to, say, some of the books that are referred to as apocryphal or other historical materials that were written at the time? How were these chosen? Well, it depends. In the case of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, it depends on which version you're talking about. There are two of them. The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in, I believe, the 2nd century BC. The legend was that 70 scholars were gathered in Alexandria, Egypt, and that each of them separately translated each of the books that were to be included in what was then to be the Hebrew Scriptures. And as it turned out, all 70 individually and on their own translated it exactly the same. That, of course, is a legend. But in any case, because of the number 70, it is referred to as the Septuagint, Greek for 70. So now the Septuagint includes books that are not in the Protestant Bible. However, it does include the books that are used in the Old Testament for both the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches. So it's a little different. If you pick up a Bible that was translated by Roman Catholic scholars, it will include books that are not included in the Old Testament that is translated by Protestant scholars. I recall the first time I learned about this was when I actually attended the Passion Play in Oberammergau, Germany. They were referring to prophecies that came from books I didn't know anything about. Well, that's because Oberammergau is a Catholic city, so they were using an Old Testament that was different from the one I was used to. In any case, the one that the Protestant church uses came into being around 100 AD. This was after the Jewish War of 66 to 70. Of all the various Jewish sects that existed prior to the Jewish War and that we read about in the Gospels of the New Testament, for example, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, there were the Essenes, the Zealots. There were various groups of Jews, and the ones that survived were the Pharisees, because the Pharisees, their focus was almost entirely on Mosaic law. For them, for the Pharisees, Mosaic law was the center of Jewish religion and faith. The Sadducees, for example, who were in charge of the temple, for them the temple was the center of Jewish life. And so, well, the temple now was gone, and so that was the end of that particular group. In any case, after the war, the remnants of the Pharisees got together, the rabbis, and gathered together what they considered to be the inspired books that should be included in the canon of the Hebrew Bible. This took place in a little place called Jamnia on the Mediterranean coast. And the result of that particular gathering was the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament as the Protestants have it. So they used a little bit different criteria for determining what should be included and what should not. They had a theory as to when the time of prophecy took place within the history of Israel, and that any book that was written after the time of prophecy, after the time that the Spirit was active speaking through prophets, those books would not be included. It was only those that were inspired by the Spirit of God that would be included. So in any case, that particular Old Testament is the one that the Protestant reformers decided was the authentic one. I believe that Luther said somewhere that he thought that particular group was inspired in their selection of the books to be included, and so the Protestants adopted that particular version. So we have two versions of the Old Testament, the Septuagint and the one that was put together right around 100 years after the birth of Christ. So obviously we will be using the Protestant version in this particular class. Not all the books in the Old Testament have to do, of course, with the history of Israel. We'll be focusing mostly on that. But the books can be divided up. Different groups divide up the Old Testament in different ways, depending on who you're talking about. The Jewish people divide it up differently than Christians do. But the way we're going to do it is in the following way. Number one, the first section we call the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes referred to as the books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's the Torah. Then there are the books of history, which begin with the book of Joshua and the story of the conquest of the Promised Land, through the book of Judges and the tribal confederacy, the first years of the state of Israel as existed in the ancient world. And then through the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, where we begin the story of the united monarchy. And of course, the major focus there is the story of King David. And then the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, which follows the kings of Israel and Judah, who, of course, separated. There was a northern and a southern kingdom after the reign of Solomon. There was a disagreement between Solomon's son Rehoboam and the 10 northern tribes, and the 10 northern tribes decided to go off on their own. So that resulted in two kingdoms, the northern kingdom taking the name of Israel for itself, and the southern kingdom referred to as Judah. So you have the kings of Israel and Judah in this, the story of those kings in the books of the Kings. And then also in the Old Testament, you have what's called the writings or wisdom literature. That includes the book of Job, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, the Psalms, and books of wisdom and insight, worship, and so forth, poetry. And then there are the books of the prophets, which is divided up into two sections as well. Major and minor prophets, the major being the ones who wrote the most. So that would be the most well-known, obviously, would be Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, although also included in the major prophets, I believe, is the book of Lamentations and Daniel, which came much later than those prophets. And then there's the minor prophets. They are the shorter books of the prophets. So that's the way the Old Testament is divided up for Protestants. And then, of course, with respect to the New Testament, which we are probably somewhat more familiar with, most of us, there's the four Gospels, the story of Jesus' ministry, his passion and his resurrection. And then there are the letters, which are divided into two subsections. There are the letters of Paul, and then the general letters, which include letters by Peter, John, James, the letter to the Hebrews. Nobody knows who wrote that one. It got into the New Testament initially because people thought Paul had written it. And then, of course, the New Testament ends with the book of Revelation, which at the time people thought was written by the Apostle John. Actually, this was an elder of the church, or churches, I should say, congregations in Asia Minor. He was an elder in those churches, and his name was also John, but it was not John, the apostle of Jesus. So how were those particular books chosen? Well, the criteria used at the time was that in order to get into the New Testament, you had to have been an eyewitness of the events surrounding Jesus' ministry, his life, his death, his resurrection. Or if you weren't a direct witness, you had to have been writing on behalf of a direct witness. So, for example, it was believed that Mark was written by an associate of Peter, that Peter was responsible for the content. Luke was written, he was a physician of Paul, so it was thought. and Paul was the inspiration for Luke, and the other books that made it into the New Testament were all believed to have come from eyewitnesses. So that's how we receive the canon as it is. Now, in terms of the approaches of study to the scripture that we are going to use in this course, there are different approaches to studying the Bible. The one we're the most familiar with is that you just simply read the text and talk about it. And we're going to do a lot of that because the focus is on the main characters. What I want to focus on is the main characters in biblical history and what we have to learn from them about what it means to live by faith. Now, the story of salvation, which is really what the theme of the Bible is, the story of salvation begins with Abraham. So the first section of Genesis, which is Genesis chapters 1 to 11, is often referred to as primeval history, history before recorded time. And these stories set the stage for the story of salvation. They are stories that deal with the themes that the Bible deals with, themes such as our relationship with God, the nature of sin, how our relationship with God was broken, what the results of that have been, and so forth. So the primeval history part of Genesis is Genesis 1 to 11. As I say, it begins with the stories of creation. There are two of them. And then it ends with the story of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 12, we begin the story of salvation where it begins with the call of Abraham, who is given a threefold promise from God, and he is told that in order to make that promise effective, in order to bring it into effect, he needs to leave his home and go to the place that God will show him, and that, of course, is at the time known as the land of Canaan. So we are going to spend a lot of time on the characters from Abraham and on through the stories of some of the kings and the prophets. That's where the main focus is going to be. But also, what I want to do here is include information about how the texts themselves were formed. In other words, the history of the texts. We would refer to that as literary criticism. So, for example, when we get to the Torah, for example, what we're going to discover is that there are actually 4 different sources that have gone into the Torah as we know it. One that originated in the northern kingdom of Israel, one that originated in the southern kingdom of Judah, one that originated with the priestly class, and then the book of Deuteronomy, which was separate from the other material. So you've got all 4 sources that went into the formation of the text as we have it. And we'll be talking more about that when we get to that part of the class. But that's one approach to biblical study, the literary analysis of the text. Another, of course, is archaeology. Archaeology is a relatively young science, but it's a science that has resulted in a lot of very valuable information about the Bible. And so we are going to look at what the archaeologists have found, both in the last century and more recently. For example, not that long ago, a group purchased the land where ancient Magdala was, the place that Mary Magdalene came from. And they excavated it and discovered a first century synagogue. This would have been a synagogue that was there at the time of Jesus. And so archaeology also has unearthed a lot of very valuable information about how the people lived at the time, what their houses were like, and other information that will help us to better understand the story of salvation as we have it in the Bible. So we have literary, we have archaeology, and then there's also ancient documents, particularly documents that originate from two different places. Palestine is squeezed between Egypt to the south and what was Mesopotamia to the north, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, which is part of what's called the Fertile Crescent and includes Canaan. But in any case, there were civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia that predate Israel by a lot of years, and there are documents, some of which pertain to the story as we have it in the Bible. So, for example, a stele, I think is the way you pronounce it, it's an ancient monument that has messages printed on it. There was a pharaoh by the name of Merneptah, and he, on one of these monuments, he had printed on there all of the peoples that he had conquered or otherwise had neutralized in some way. And this thing dates to, I don't know, it's the 1240 or 1230, somewhere in there BC. That is the first mention of Israel that we have outside of the Bible, where Pharaoh Merneptah says Israel's seed is no more. What that means, we'll talk about when we get to it, but it does help us date, for example, the Exodus and the settlement of Palestine by the people who would later become known as the Israelites or the Hebrew people. And then also I want to make use of what's known simply as biblical theology. Okay, biblical theology just simply asks the questions that theologians ask of the biblical text. What does this text teach us about who God is? What does this text teach us about the nature of God? Or what does this text teach us about human nature? What does this text teach us about the relationship between human beings and God? What does this text teach us about what God is doing about, the problems that exist, and so forth? So a good example there is the first story of creation, the very familiar 7 days of creation story. This is a priestly document, a document that was probably preserved and composed in its present form by the priestly class in Israel because it has particular interest in things that the priests would have been concerned to preserve, especially things related to the Sabbath. But in any case, if you look carefully at that text, you discover that it's saying something very precise about who God is in relation to creation that sets the Hebrews apart from many of its pagan neighbors. So, for example, throughout the 7 days of creation, God is not identified with any part of creation. Rather, God is the creator of all things that exist. So it would not be possible, for example, using the Hebrew creation story, the first one, it would not be possible to identify any created thing as having divine attributes, whether that be the sun or the moon or the stars. They're created objects. They're not divine beings. And so in that particular creation story, we have some very specific theological insights that are presented that are important for us. It's not, unfortunately, over time, this has become an issue of who's right. The Bible, as the way it tells the story of creation, or the scientists who tell the story in a much different way. Well, if people simply understood that the biblical account of creation is a theological document, not a scientific document, we could avoid those kind of foolish, ridiculous issues. There is no conflict here between science and the biblical text with respect to creation. The two disciplines are talking about two different things. So anyway, we'll also be looking at biblical theology in this particular class. Okay, I want to keep these lectures short and to the point so that I don't overly use up your attention span. So I'm going to do it in short segments, a half an hour at a time. And we are currently, according to my phone here, at 27 minutes and 44 seconds. My goodness, that went by so fast. So now you have received written versions of the lectures through most of the period from Abraham. We covered Abraham in the written portion, and I got to the story of the Exodus and Moses in the last one. We have some more to say about that, but we will begin in our next lecture. We will begin with the story of Abraham and go as far as we can from there. So I hope you'll tune in. And again, please let me know if you haven't received the lectures. I'd be happy to email them to you. Send me an email and I'll send them out. I hope you're all doing well. I miss seeing you in class, but we will be together again as soon as we get this virus under control. But in the meantime, technology is also a miraculous thing. And so we'll do it using technology. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye for now.